So now you get the dry academic response to Dina's impassioned and very clear articulated arguments. But actually what I'm going to talk about is a little more ammunition, I think, for you as delegates and as union members and for the rest of your membership. David Malin made a very clear set of points about the value of unions, keeping unions strong in a society and an economy because of the various things they do in a society. When they get too weak, they can kind of be pushed to the sidelines. So I'm going to reinforce some of those seemingly boring points that people thought were going to be made with some visual aids and to reinforce what unions do to mitigate inequality, which actually, on the face of it, you might hear arguments that counter that unions actually produce inequality, right? Because you have these great benefits, these great wages, and what about the non-union sector that seems to lie so much below? So how is it that unions actually do promote equality given the evidence that we do know that unions do so much for their members? So I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about how another version of inequality is in the political space. How do we create a more equitable society? Well, unions do work there too, and I'm going to reinforce again some points that were made generally by David earlier this morning, but reinforce them with rock-solid data and analysis. And finally, what about at the workplace? What do they do to equalize outcomes inside of workplaces? And this is where I think my points might be the most controversial. I have, I think, a few things that, from my own research and my own studies of other labor systems across the world, that show a different path forward, perhaps, for the non-union workers that Dina has just mentioned. She's right, the Employment Standards Act is their collective agreement, and I think there's a lot of room and clever and creative space for unions to play a role, which they're not playing now. And in fact, they're moving in a different direction, potentially, that could, I think, harm that group of workers. So that'll be the last point I'll make. But let's begin with the main question about unions and inequality, and we think about it in monetary terms. Why is it that they do reduce inequality in society? On the face of it, they should be increasing it, and this is what kind of free market economists argued in the 60s and 70s, without evidence, mind you, but in theory. Unions raise wages for members. So there you have it. This is just data taken from one of many sources that could be replicated a million times. The top line is the unionized nurse, and the bottom line is the non-union nurse, or at least the group of nurses. There's a huge wage gap, and you can see over time it's growing. This is data from the US. I'd find it anywhere for any occupation. This gap exists. Some of this gap narrows when you take account of people's skills. Unions tend to have higher skilled workers, so you'd expect them to get higher wages anyway, so the union effect is not totally there. But what's true is unions increase wages. This should produce inequality in society, and that's what right-wing economists like Milton Friedman argued in the 70s. But what they missed is that unions compress wages on every other dimension. This is not the graph I wanted, that's the one. The bottom line is now the difference in male-female wages for union workers. And the top line is the difference between male-female wages for non-union workers. So in other words, everything else that adds to inequality is shrunk by unions' presence. Men and women wage differentials are lower in unionized environments. Youth-adult differentials are lower in unionized environments. Immigrant, non-immigrant wage differentials are lower in unionized environments. In other words, all the other things that add to inequality in society, unions diminish by their presence. They equalize things. They standardize jobs, taking that individual element often out that could produce bias, and unions replace it with more equality. They do this across almost every dimension that you can think of. I just had four categories, but in almost every case, and this is going across the distribution of people's earnings, in the lowest 10th, in the middle 20th, 50th, 70th, unionized workers earn more than non-union workers. And that's where you get what Trudeau's fond of saying, rebuilding the middle class. The biggest institution that does that is a trade union. Notice at the top, though, that the highest paid workers take a hit. So if you're a really top-end unionized person working, you're not going to earn as much as you would have in the non-union sector. But that's what happens, that's how you get equality in society, right? You increase it for the 90%, and sure, at the top end, you lose. But what those 90% get in return is job security, better benefits, better pensions. It's a trade-off that maybe most people would be willing to make. So that's how unions do it. And this is just a graph that covers it for three groups in society. they do the same thing. They increase wages across the broad spectrum where most people earn wages, from the 10th to the 70th percentile. And at the very top, they kind of reduce it because they squeeze the distribution, taking the top end out but raising the bottom up and keeping the middle higher. So that's how unions do. They also have this indirect effect, which is fascinating, which is if you look at inequality, pre and post taxation, so get this through your head. So unions, through this evidence, should decrease inequality pre-taxation, right? Because they raise wages for the broad number of people, kind of reducing it for the very top. But they also reduce inequality after taxation. In other words, they're an influencer, they're an institution that promotes policies, general ones like progressive taxation, healthcare spending, that also adds to this reduction of inequality. So do you follow? So the importance of unions is twofold. At the workplace, representing workers, raising wages for the middle and bottom end, and as a societal institution, also doing a lot to reduce inequality, even after wages have kind of already settled and sorted themselves out. These are busy graphs, but what they show you, if you can look at the very top here, I think this is the one that I wanted to show. So gross income over on the left, and on the vertical axis, so these are all country little data points, specific countries over time. The key thing is to look at the far right. That line goes down, and the bottom is how many of your workers are unionized in your society. So the greater union density, the more inequality is reduced. And the thing that's going up along the vertical axis is inequality. So unions act as sort of these compression agents. They compress wages going in terms of what they do in the workplace, and then foster, or at least create an acceptance or a tolerance in society for greater taxation. No better example, of course, than Sweden. 90% union coverage and the highest taxation levels probably in the Western world. The two go hand in hand. And so one slips, and then tolerance for redistribution and public spending also goes down. So this is why it's important to keep the two working together. They also, interestingly enough, reduce wages of people who aren't even union members. This is research I worked on with a colleague, looked at CEO pay in the US, where unions aren't as present, but you'd be surprised, in large workplaces, about 1 in 3 companies has to deal with a union. And what we found that even there, CEO pay is lower, especially at the top end when they have to deal with the union. And this line goes down as the sort of distribution of pay goes along from the lowest to the highest. The key thing is look at the line at the far right at the 90th percentile. That means the top CEO earners. And if you can see along the vertical axis, those are negative numbers, meaning CEOs who have to deal with unions in their companies earn less than CEOs in non-union companies. There's a lot of good reasons for it. The most obvious is if you're negotiating, you're giving yourself huge pay increases. Well, in a collective agreement context, you're signaling that your firm is quite healthy. You have to give those monies and resources back to your workers. So as an institution, they affect almost every indicator of inequality that you can find, even CEOs. And we worry about excessive executive compensation. Well, this is one way of reducing it. So the evidence is clear. Unions reduce income and wage inequality in a whole bunch of ways. So the old market arguments that unions increase are just not viable. We also heard about unions' role in civic participation, and David Maitland made good comments how unions affect a whole spectrum of civic action. This is voter turnout in Canada, voter turnout data going to, I think, 2000, I can't read my own, but anyway, up to the mid-2000s. A little bump, I think that was the federal election where Trudeau won. But the trend has been down. And you can see that with declining voter trends, if you mapped in declining unionization, you'd see a correlation. Now, being, of course, an academic, correlation does not prove causation until you look at the numbers more deeply, and then it does. These are actually tables that show union and non-union members along a spectrum of all kinds of civic participating activities, from just the minimal voting in one election, voting in all elections, to the sort of the bottom line measure, which averages everything, volunteering for a political party or signing a petition. So across everything, union members are about 10 percentage points more likely to do any of these things. And if you look at the overall rate, about 30, that's a 30% increased likelihood of participating if you're a union member. And this is true, by the way, across many countries. This was data for Canada, and this was data for the European Union set of countries. And one of the things we could break down there was very interesting. So this is voter turnout, and again, the lines show you the separation between union and non-union. Union members are more civically active. Interestingly, you break it up, a non-union member can be two people, actually. It could be a non-union member who once was a member, we call those ex-members, and a non-union member who's never participated. Well, guess who's the least likely? The never member. Someone who's never been exposed to anything that unions do. They're the least likely to participate. Look at the difference between ex-members and current members. I would argue that shows you the power and impact that being in a union has. Because you could otherwise argue, well, the never member is someone who's really individualistic, hates communal activities, won't vote anyway. But then the ex-member and the union member line should almost be the same if unions did nothing. They clearly do something, and they activate and mobilize and perhaps trigger those sort of civic skills that you would otherwise not have used. And they are skills. Coming to conventions, learning the value of voting on any number of propositions or articles is giving you tangible skills that you then take outside of the workplace, outside of your union membership. And that's something we're realizing. When people are completely disengaged, they drop out of the workplace, their engagement levels fall everywhere. So when voice and democracy is missing at work, it starts to be missing in society. And I think there's a great quote, Justice Wagner, who was one of the formulators of the Wagner Act, made a very prescient point in the 1930s that fascism doesn't begin on the political stump speeches. It begins in the workplace with authoritarianism and autocratic behavior. So democracy is, I think, given life by what happens in the workplace, and unions contribute to democracy and equalizing that part. So I'm running against time, and I think this is probably the most important part, but I'll be very quick. What do unions do to foster voice and equalize outcomes in the workplace? Oh, okay. I can take my time. Great. But I won't stretch out any points. I'll just make the points I have. These two graphs just show you, there are deficiencies in our current system that give workers voice at the workplace through unions. In most cases, card checks have been abandoned. You need to vote. And if you ask people expressly, would you vote for a union? The numbers come out to about 40% of workers who are non-union who would vote for a union. In the US and Canada, those numbers are actually strikingly similar. And those are the blue bar charts that you see. The sort of pinkish bar charts are the number of people who actually have a union. So when we talk about the representation gap, clearly in the US there's a greater one than in Canada, but they still exist, meaning the people who want unions versus people who have them aren't getting it. You don't get what you want, which I thought in a consumer market society we all get what we want, except people who want unions, apparently, because they don't get it, because of the structure of the way we create a majoritarian workplace-based model. So what's the problem here? Well, when you reframe the question, take the word union out, start asking people, would you want an organization that negotiates on your behalf over wages and benefits? There you're crossing the threshold, right, of almost 50%. Again, US and Canada being shown here. The reason why US has a slightly higher, this is for non-union workers, remember, and there are more of them in the US. Fewer of them, therefore, have some of these systems. We have more union representation. So the pink line is sort of outdistancing the blue line here because the US has more non-union people who want these things and don't have them. That's what David Maitland said. When you actually ask people, people are more communitarian than you would think given some of their voting patterns in political elections. That's because half of them don't vote, and of the half, only a small majority then vote for parties that don't enact some of these things that could help workers and representation. Look at this one, the one that gets the most. Imagine you had an employee organization that discusses workplace issues with management, or an organization that represents employees who file grievances. There you're close to 50, 60, 70, 80% in one of the cases. So stripping the kind of stereotypes around what unions do away from these questions, but then describe exactly what unions do shows you that a majority of people do want them. So that's the gap. I think that's the concern. Given there is this latent demand and desire for collective voice at the workplace, how do you provide it? Because the current system of organizing a workplace, as Dina said, leaves 6 million Ontario workers out and many more across the country. And I think we have to learn what the numbers are showing us, and that's that, you know, most employees in large workplaces, this is for Canada, and looking at the UK, it's identical, have a union if you're in a large workplace. Half. This is 50%. This is data that comes from like 2014. Large workplaces have union representation, far greater numbers than maybe we're accustomed when we look at the overall rates. The problem is this coupling. Most small workplaces are in the private sector, and small workplaces are inherently hard to organize, and that's where most of the job growth, employment growth has happened over the last 20 years, 30 years. So we need to get voice and systems of representation started in smaller workplaces. And how to do that takes a lot of creativity. It must sometimes rely on things that unions thought were opposed to their interests, you know, statutory workplace councils or committees, or even what were called company unions at one time, were seen as stumbling blocks, substitutes for unions. But the point is that you don't find unions in small workplaces anyway, so they're not substituting. They're actually creating the conditions that show workers what an organization that might provide representation on behalf of workers to management looks like. And here's the thing for unions when they think about it. If management stumbles, if they actually don't provide the goods with some of these, we'll call them alternative forms of representation, that's when a union can more successfully step in and say, we can provide that protection for you. And organizing can actually leapfrog on top of these institutions that are embedded in non-union workplaces. Now, that's a lot to pack in, and you can read more. I've put some of these documents, I think, in the hands of the organizers, and if you choose to read and find out more, there's also a lot available on the Centre's website. All the submissions that came about as part of the Changing Workplace Review in Ontario are available at the University of Toronto at the Centre's website. Okay? Thank you for giving me the extra time.